Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Claire had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in her head, but when the day finally came, she found herself trembling as if the ground beneath her might split apart and swallow her whole. Her son, a bright-eyed boy with an innocence untouched by the chaos of the Newman legacy, clutched her hand tightly as they stood outside Victoria Newman's sprawling home. And the weight of years of secrets pressed down on her chest so heavily she could barely breathe, because she knew that once she crossed this threshold, nothing would ever be the same again, not for her, not for her child, and certainly not for the mother she had once longed for but had been too afraid to fully embrace. Victoria, waiting inside, had no idea what storm was about to blow through her front door, and when she opened it, her sharp yet vulnerable eyes widened at the sight of Claire standing there with a child who looked so much like a mixture of them both that denial became impossible, and Claire, unable to hold back any longer, let the floodgates open, telling her mother everything. The lies she had been fed by Jordan, the torment of growing up believing she was unworthy, the mistakes she made in Genoa City when she first returned under a cloud of vengeance, and the crushing guilt she carried for having almost destroyed the very family she secretly wanted to belong to. Her words tumbling out so fast and raw that her son squeezed her hand even tighter, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. And as Victoria listened, her initial shock turned into anguish and then into a slow, dawning empathy, because the pieces of the puzzle she had struggled with for months suddenly fit together, painting a portrait of a daughter who had been lost but who was now standing right in front of her, begging not for forgiveness exactly, but for a chance to finally be seen. And Claire, unable to keep her composure, collapsed into tears, sobbing uncontrollably as she admitted that every night she had tucked her son into bed she had whispered stories about a grandmother he had never met, hoping one day she would be brave enough to bring him here. And now that day had come, she was terrified that it was too late, that Victoria's heart might be too hardened by betrayal to allow space for them. But in that moment, as the boy stepped forward with innocent curiosity and asked, "Are you my grandma?" the walls crumbled, and Victoria, overwhelmed by the purity of his question, pulled both Claire and her grandson into her arms, tears streaming down her face as she promised that no matter how broken their pasts were, they would find a way to heal, because love, messy, complicated, and unexpected, was stronger than all the lies that had tried to keep them apart. And for the first time in her life, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her son had finally found their home, even as she knew that the revelations she had just unleashed would ripple through the Newman family like an earthquake, forcing Victor, Nikki, Nick, and every single person tied to their dynasty to reckon with truths they never imagined and bonds they could no longer deny. And while the tears kept flowing, what filled the room most powerfully was not despair but the fragile, undeniable spark of a new beginning that had been waiting to ignite for far too long. Claire's confession lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, thick and impossible to ignore. And though Victoria clutched both her daughter and grandson with an instinctive protectiveness that surprised even herself, her mind was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and an aching tenderness she hadn't dared feel in years, because as much as she wanted to give in to the miracle of this reunion, she could not silence the echo of all the pain, betrayal, and manipulation that had come before. She thought of Jordan's cruel schemes, of the months spent second-guessing Claire's intentions, of the sleepless nights wondering whether her trust had been misplaced, and now, with this child gazing up at her with those wide eyes so filled with innocence, Victoria realized that her own heart was at war with itself, one side still reeling from the trauma of deceit while the other beat desperately to embrace this newfound family connection. And as Claire sobbed into her mother's shoulder, confessing that she had been terrified Victoria would slam the door in her face, Victoria whispered brokenly that she could never deny the boy standing there, her grandson, and that maybe she couldn't deny Claire anymore either, though she admitted with raw honesty that it would take time to build what they had lost. Claire nodded through her tears, promising that she wasn't asking for immediate absolution but simply the chance to be part of something real, to raise her son with roots that stretched deeper than lies. And as the boy clung to his grandmother's hand, Victoria finally allowed herself to smile through her tears, a fragile but genuine smile that told Claire perhaps they had both turned a corner. Though even in this moment of unity the Newman matriarch couldn't shake the sense that their lives were about to grow infinitely more complicated, because family secrets rarely stayed buried, and the revelation of Claire's child would ripple far beyond these walls. forcing every member of the Newman dynasty to reckon with truths they were unprepared to face. Victor Newman, ever the patriarch and protector, would demand answers about who the boy's father was, what kind of life Claire had been living, and whether the child's presence could threaten the empire he had built, while Nikki, fragile yet steely, would have to face her own complicated history with Claire, knowing that forgiveness was never simple but perhaps necessary for the sake of the next generation. Nick, ever the big brother, would be torn between skepticism and compassion, wanting to shield Victoria from more heartbreak while also recognizing the boy's undeniable claim to their bloodline. And even Adam, watching from the sidelines, would surely see an opportunity to manipulate the situation for his own gain. Because in Genoa City every secret was a weapon waiting to be wielded, and Claire's tearful revelations, as cathartic as they were, had only opened the door to a storm that none of them were prepared for. Yet as Victoria drew her daughter and grandson closer, she made a silent vow to herself that no matter how turbulent the days ahead would be, she would fight for this bond, because she had been given a second chance at motherhood, and though her heart still ached with grief for all the years lost, she refused to let fear or anger steal any more of the future that lay before them. Claire, hearing the softness in her mother's voice and feeling the strength of her embrace, let herself believe, for the first time, that she wasn't alone anymore. And as she wiped her tears and whispered the final secret she had been holding back, that the boy had often asked about his grandmother, and she had painted a picture of Victoria as a woman strong, brilliant, and unshakable, Victoria broke down all over again, because in her daughter's words she heard not just pain but hope, a fragile hope that demanded to be nurtured, and together, with their tears mingling and their son's laughter breaking through the heaviness of the room, they stood on the precipice of a new chapter, one that promised as much danger as it did redemption, but one that, for the first time, they would face together as a family, even as shadows loomed at the edges, waiting for their chance to strike. But even as Victoria held her daughter and grandson in her arms, her mind churned restlessly with the knowledge that the moment they stepped beyond the threshold of her home, the entire Newman world would change forever, because secrets this big never stayed hidden, and already she could imagine the piercing questions her father would unleash the second he learned the truth. Victor Newman, a man who built an empire on control and foresight, would see this as a blindside that shook the very foundation of his dynasty. And though Victoria longed for his approval and strength, she also dreaded his fury, because Victor's love often came with conditions and his acceptance was never without suspicion. So she knew that once he discovered Claire had not only been hiding her own son but had now placed him squarely in the center of Newman territory, he would interrogate every detail: who the father was, whether the boy's parentage might expose the family to scandal, and whether Claire herself could be trusted to stay loyal rather than drag them into chaos again. Nikki, on the other hand, would feel the weight of grandmotherhood in her own heart, a tender ache that would battle against her lingering resentment toward Claire for past betrayals. And though she would want to protect the child, she would have to dig deep to find forgiveness for the daughter who had once allied with Jordan and nearly destroyed them. Yet Nikki's own journey of redemption after years of mistakes might be the bridge that allowed her to open her arms to both Claire and the boy, even if her forgiveness came in halting, uncertain steps. Nick, Victoria's rock and often her fiercest critic, would almost certainly take the role of protector, questioning Claire's motives and warning Victoria against trusting too quickly. Yet even he would struggle to deny the truth in the boy's eyes, the bloodline written in his features, the innocence that proved he was blameless in all of this. Nick's conflict would simmer, torn between defending his sister and embracing his nephew, and the push-pull of that dynamic would ripple into every conversation. And then, hovering at the edges like a shadow, there was Adam, whose cunning mind would immediately seize on the revelation as a possible weapon, because Adam had spent years positioning himself as the outlier of the family, the one Victor either underestimated or distrusted, and this new child, this living link to Newman power, could either be a rival or a pawn, depending on how Adam chose to play it. And the thought of him whispering doubts into Claire's ear, sowing discord between mother and daughter, was a danger Victoria could not ignore. Yet even with all these threats swirling in her imagination, she found herself looking down at her grandson's smile and realizing that the only path forward was through love, not fear, and that if she tried to shield him from the Newman storm, she would only repeat the mistakes of the past where secrets had bred resentment and lies had fueled vendettas. Claire, too, seemed to understand the stakes, her trembling voice steadying as she told Victoria she was ready to face whatever fallout came. that she would stand by her son and her mother no matter what Victor, Nikki, Nick, or even Adam threw at them, because hiding was no longer an option. She had lived too many years in shadows and silence, and it was time to bring everything into the light. Victoria, though still raw and overwhelmed, found strength in that resolve. And in that moment she promised both herself and her daughter that when the questions came, when the judgment arrived, she would not let Claire face it alone, because family, even broken, battered, complicated family, was worth fighting for, and if the Newmans had taught her anything, it was that survival was only possible if you stood united. And though tears still stained her cheeks, a fire flickered in her eyes as she realized this wasn't just an ending to years of lies but the messy, fragile beginning of something new, something that could either save them all or tear them apart, depending on how the days ahead unfolded. And yet, as the quiet aftershock of that reunion settled into the walls of Victoria Newman's grand estate, a fragile peace that might have lasted a lifetime in another world was already trembling under the weight of unseen forces, because Claire, though relieved beyond measure to have unburdened herself, felt the gnawing reminder that secrets rarely died in silence, and now that her truth was out in the open, the ripples would become waves crashing against every member of the Newman dynasty, dragging them into waters none of them had ever swum before. For even as Victoria smoothed her daughter's hair and pressed a trembling kiss to her grandson's forehead, trying to savor the miracle in front of her, she could already hear her father's voice echoing in her mind, Victor's booming demand for explanations, his instinctive suspicion that every revelation carried with it a hidden agenda, his unrelenting obsession with protecting the Newman empire above all else, and Victoria knew that introducing Claire's son into their world would test every line of loyalty, especially when Victor began digging into the boy's father, a topic Claire had avoided thus far but could no longer hide from, because the question was not if it would be asked but when, and the answer, tangled with shame and fear, might prove to be the most explosive truth of all. Nikki, for her part, would find herself torn between her instinctive role as a grandmother desperate to shower this child with love and her deep wounds from Claire's betrayals, remembering the horror of Jordan's schemes and the bitterness of having trusted only to be burned. Yet Nikki's own history of redemption, her battles with alcoholism, her reckless choices, her cycle of falling and rising again, might allow her to see Claire not as an enemy but as a reflection of her own flawed humanity, a daughter in need of grace, and that recognition could be the very bridge that saved Claire from complete rejection, though the path toward it would not be smooth but littered with the shards of mistrust. Meanwhile, Nick would step into his familiar position as the family's moral compass and skeptic-in-chief, pacing his sister's living room with clenched fists, firing off pointed questions Claire had no easy answers to, his voice rising with protective anger as he demanded to know how Victoria could let herself be blindsided again. Yet even Nick, with all his suspicion, would falter when his gaze landed on the boy, the undeniable proof of bloodline and innocence written across the child's features. And though Nick might lash out at Claire, warning her that Newman loyalty had to be earned not inherited, his heart would soften in secret, for he could never look into his nephew's eyes and see an enemy. Adam, however, was a different matter, his dark eyes narrowing as he weighed the new variables in the game he had been playing all his life, because for Adam, family was both weapon and wound, and Claire's son was a piece he could either protect to gain leverage or exploit to destabilize the fragile unity Victoria was trying so desperately to build. And already, in the corners of his mind, Adam would be rehearsing conversations, plotting how to whisper doubts into Claire's ears about whether Victoria truly loved her or whether she was simply using her as a pawn to polish the Newman brand of loyalty. But even as all of this loomed ahead, Victoria stood tall in the moment, gripping her daughter's hand with a strength that was both maternal and defiant, telling Claire that she was no longer alone, not now, not ever again, and that though the road ahead would be brutal, they would walk it together. And in that vow lay the spark of a new era, one where the Newmans might finally break free of the cycle of secrets and lies, or else destroy themselves. Trying, because Genoa City had never been a place where the truth stayed quiet for long. And Claire's return, with her son by her side, was not the end of their saga but the beginning of a reckoning that would test the meaning of family in ways none of them could have imagined. But even as Victoria's vow hung in the air like a fragile thread tying 3 generations together, Claire felt the uneasy shiver of dread running down her spine, because she knew better than anyone that the Newman family was a fortress built on both loyalty and suspicion, and for every warm embrace there lurked a shadow of doubt, a whispered warning that history had a cruel way of repeating itself. So when her son laughed softly in the safety of his grandmother's arms, Claire couldn't help but picture the storm of questions and accusations that awaited them beyond the sanctuary of that living room. She imagined Victor, his eyes like steel, drilling into her with demands for names, timelines, and motives, because Victor never accepted gifts without examining them for traps, and Claire was painfully aware that her very existence had once been the sharpest weapon Jordan had wielded against him, and though she had broken free, Victor might never fully believe her innocence, which meant the little boy now playing with Victoria's necklace would become an unintentional battlefield, a living reminder of choices Victor would struggle to condone. Nikki, though softer, would be no less formidable, her heart straining between grandmotherly instinct and a wariness she could not shed, and Claire feared that if Nikki's forgiveness faltered even slightly, her son would feel that rejection in his bones, a rejection she had spent her whole life trying to escape herself. Nick's skepticism, sharp and protective, would wound her too, but Claire almost welcomed it, because his doubts at least came from a place of love for his sister, a loyalty she could respect, even if it hurt, whereas Adam's silence, his calculating gaze, his slow smile, would terrify her most of all, because she had seen enough of Adam to know that his silence was never empty, it was strategy, and the idea of him using her son as a pawn in his endless chess game with Victor filled her with a fear so deep it threatened to swallow the joy of this reunion whole. And yet, despite all of these haunting possibilities, when Victoria tightened her grip on her hand, Claire felt something stir inside her that she hadn't dared to feel in years. Courage, the kind that told her she could face Victor's interrogation, Nikki's hesitation, Nick's anger, even Adam's schemes, because for the first time she wasn't standing alone, she had her mother beside her, and as impossible as it seemed, she believed they could weather the storm together. So she lifted her chin, wiped her tears, and whispered to Victoria that she was ready for whatever came next, and Victoria, eyes shimmering with both fear and determination, promised her daughter that no matter what battles lay ahead, she would never again let her slip away into the shadows of regret, because love, tested, scarred, but enduring, would be their anchor. And as the boy's innocent laughter filled the heavy silence, both women allowed themselves to believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the future could be rewritten not with secrets and lies, but with truth and a bond strong enough to withstand even the Newman storm.